All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Tina McAndrew from the Randall Library, and I'm happy to be here again for our next edition of Sustainable Stow. As I said, the program is being recorded, so if anyone you know was unable to make it tonight, it will be sent to Stow TV to be played on YouTube as well. If you don't mind muting yourselves for the duration of Glen's talk, that would just facilitate the elimination of background noise. So with that, I will hand it over to Rick of Sustainable Stow.
Thank you, Tina.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us from the West Coast.
My pleasure.
So yeah, tonight I'm very happy to have Glen Ayers speaking with us. I've heard Glen speak before. He was a terrific speaker. He was speaking then on Massachusetts Forest. I talked with him a bit and I said, you know, how about Stow? We have a lot of forests here. And I sort of talked with him about, you know, what can we learn here in Stow? Because I believe there's a lot we can learn about how we appreciate and treat trees in Stow, even though we do have a lot of conservation land in Stow already. Glen is I don't know, 40-year advocate for forests in wild areas. I think it's about 40 years. He's a soil scientist by education, but he's worked in a variety of areas. And I think there was a whole overlap, which I don't quite understand, between soil science and the health of the forests. And I thought that was interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, again, another thing I hadn't thought about relative to the health of forests and how they affect us all. So he now lives in Western Massachusetts, and he's visiting us here tonight in Stow. Welcome, Glen.
Thank you, Rick, Tina. Thanks. I appreciate the invitation. And my name's Glen Ayers. I live in Greenfield, Mass. I've been living here about 10 years. Prior to that, I lived in a nearby town of Leverett for, almost 25 years. And I've been in Massachusetts for, 31 years. Since 1991, I think, when I left Colorado, moved back east to be closer to family. I went to graduate school out in Colorado, and it was so nice. I grew up in New Jersey. It was so nice in Colorado that it took me 8 years to finish my master's degree. It was a great experience. Of course, I was younger and had a lot of fun. The mountains and the plains were amazing. So I am here tonight as an advocate for trees and forests, and especially the climate. And I know Rick from Elders Climate Action. And I see Alan. I also know Alan from that group, which is a great group of activists, mostly, I think I could say mostly retired professional elder people, but not all. And it's a really, really good group. I've really enjoyed working with them for the last couple of years. But I have been involved in a lot of environmental groups over the years. So I'm going to do a slideshow, and I will share my presentation. And let's see. Know how to get the slideshow started, because you can't really see.
If you go to slideshow.
Yeah, I got it.
There you go.
There it is. So in general, I want to talk about the role of forests, trees in addressing the climate emergency. And I know just a week or two ago, the IPCC came out with the second part of their report on the climate emergency, as I like to call it, and pretty grim reading. I read the summary for policymakers, and it's pretty hard to get through. I have read some of the previous IPCC reports, but as they say, there is a window that is rapidly closing, and we need to be taking a lot more action than we currently are, and not just the people on this call, but everyone. So I'm going to put it in that context. And a little over a year ago, we passed the Next Generation Roadmap Bill here in Massachusetts. And that legislation envisions a drastic reduction in the emissions of greenhouse gases, but it also envisions a significant contribution toward reducing the impact of climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And really the only technology that we have right now at scale is nature. And so the more that we can protect our forests, trees, even in urban areas, that is really essential to meeting this goal of net zero by 2050. So I want to talk tonight about what does that mean? And specifically, what does forest disturbance or forest degradation, or another word for that is logging, do to carbon storage? And what kind of incentives will we need to put in place to incentivize the forest protection or forest management for climate benefits? And I'll talk a little bit about some legislative solutions trying to address that. So about me, I am a soil scientist. I am retired. I have had a career as a public servant working for state and local governments. I most recently was the regional health agent for Franklin County, and I worked in that capacity over I don't know, almost 20 years in that capacity. I worked for about 15 different towns, sometimes working as a health agent for 8 towns at once at the same time. I was a shared health agent in a health district. And prior to that, I did graduate school out in Colorado, worked on the reclamation of abandoned mine land. And there was a lot of abandoned mine land in the US that needs to be reclaimed. In Pennsylvania, where I worked for the state in the 1980s, I also worked on reclamation of mine land there. And I went to graduate school in the late 80s in Colorado, and I became an Earth First activist. I was in my 20s. It was a great time. And I specifically worked on appealing timber sales on the national forest out in Colorado, but then expanded that to other areas of the West. And I moved back here in '91 and sued the US Forest Service from Massachusetts, but I sued the Forest Service in Colorado in federal district court. That was the District of Colorado. And wherever there are these blue things in parentheses, that's a hyperlink. And I'll send a PDF of this that can be distributed, and you could click on that. And if you wanted to read about that lawsuit, you could. That's an actual link to the lawsuit. And we won. I won. I was the lead plaintiff in that. And the Forest Service sent me a check for $10,000. But I had an agreement with my attorney, who was working pro bono, that if we got any money, it was his. So I signed the back of the check and put it in the envelope and mailed him $10,000. And then the Forest Service appealed that, and we settled because the appellate courts, federal appellate courts in the West are very, very conservative. And we probably would have lost everything. So we kept some stuff. It had to do with clear cutting at a high altitude in the Rockies. And it was a pretty rare example of a successful lawsuit. against logging on national forests under the National Forest Management Act. And then when I moved back to Massachusetts in the early 90s, I became, I accumulated a lot of initials after my name. So I'm a registered sanitarian, a certified health officer, I'm actually a justice of the peace. And I got a lot of certifications, a public water supply operator, wastewater treatment plant operator, and several others, mostly related to public health. And I had a great time enforcing. I did a lot of enforcement of laws, public health laws, sanitary laws. But then in 2019, I got involved with a group of folks in a nearby town close to Greenfields, the Wendell State Forest, where there was a logging project going on there on state forest. And I was one of the 29 plaintiffs in the 29 citizens of the Commonwealth versus the Secretary of the Department of Energy and Environment. And that was the Wendell State Forest lawsuit. So that's a little bit of my background. I have not spent any time in Stow except passing through. And this is off of Mass Mapper. And I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that, but it's the Mass GIS online mapping tool. It's really great. If you don't know it, I included a link to it on the next slide, and that'll be a hyperlink in the PDF. But as you know, you live there, there is a lot of conservation land in Stow. You're very, very fortunate, but I think that didn't happen by accident. There were a lot of people that worked to conserve this land. And I know your town participates in the Community Preservation Act. And I don't know if you've used CPA money to preserve some of the land in Stow. But when I lived in Leverett, I was on a land trust that just operated in the town of Leverett. And we used the CPA funding to do a lot of conservation projects in Leverett, and very good use of the CPA funding as far as I was concerned. So you also have the National Wildlife Refuge, part of it in Stow, and all of that makes it really nice. It looks to me like a really nice complex of pretty connected lands throughout the town. There are probably still other areas that could be protected, but I think it's a good base of protected land. So the next generation climate roadmap bill, which sets up the climate policies in Massachusetts, theoretically for the next 30 years. Its goal is to get us to essentially zero carbon emissions or zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But there's a little bit of a caveat to that, in that it's called net zero, which means that there are going to be some greenhouse gas emissions that are practically impossible to eliminate. And those will be essentially offset by removals from the atmosphere, especially of CO2, carbon dioxide. And that is primarily going to happen in the terrestrial ecosystem by trees and soil. And in a forest, about half of the carbon is stored above ground and about half is stored below ground in the roots and in the soil. So keep that in mind when you think about carbon storage, that it's roughly, depending upon the age of the forest, as the forest gets older, more carbon, a higher percentage of carbon is stored below ground than above ground. But in the kind of forests that we have, which are, pretty much less than 100 years old, it's about a 50-50 mix. So natural forests are critical for carbon storage. And In Massachusetts, we have approximately 1 million acres of publicly owned lands, which include state-owned forests and municipal forests, as well as some privately owned conservation areas. Limited amount of that, but we have no national forests like they do in the West specifically, or, for instance, the Green Mountain National Forest, the White Mountain National Forest. We don't have that national equivalent here in Massachusetts. So we really rely on our state lands and our town forests, municipal forests, to essentially provide what the national forests would be providing in other states. That publicly owned land is the most readily accessible land for us to protect for climate benefits. And my feeling is that the state and municipalities have to be very active in protecting forests for their climate and biodiversity benefits. So how is logging regulated in Massachusetts? Well, it's still regulated by a bill that was passed back in the 1930s, when there was a tremendous amount of abandoned forest land that had been cut over, had grown back in brush, was subject to brush fires. The last time we had really extensive wildfires in Massachusetts was during that period post-abandonment, when the agricultural land was abandoned, the forests were returning. And if there was a drought, that young vegetation, especially if it had a lot of grass associated with it, was very susceptible to wildfire. And there would be thousands of acres burning in various parts of Massachusetts. And at that time, there was a big effort made to protect that land and actually to reforest it. So there were a lot of plantations that were planted to red pine and white oak and Norway spruce. And a lot of those plantations now are 70, 80, 90 years old or older. And they are, I don't want to say they're not natural, because they've been growing for a long time, but they are slowly being replaced by the native vegetation in a lot of cases. And so they are declining, especially the red pine plantations. But this section of the Mass General Law, called the Forest Cutting Practices Act, set up the basic policy for the public welfare that forests needed to be protected for all of these benefits. And in addition, and this is for all forests in Massachusetts, they also should supply forest products such as wood for, remember this 1930s, for farm consumption and for the wood using industries in the Commonwealth. So that's the basic law that is in place to deal with logging in Massachusetts. There are also these things called best management practices, which are guidelines, and the BMPs, as they're called, are suggestions. They're voluntary unless they are incorporated into the actual forest plan, specifically listed and approved or incorporated as a condition. They're only suggestions. And they have not been revised in about 10 years. And the existing best management practices do not really deal with climate at all. They mention briefly that carbon sequestration occurs in forests, but it's just in a sentence. There are no, for instance, there are no best practices for conserving carbon or conserving the biggest trees in the forest. And I'll talk about the biggest trees in the forest a little bit later. But these guidelines are very outdated. The law is outdated, and these BMPs are outdated. They need to be updated. So, what is the the Department of Conservation and Recreation approves logging plans in Massachusetts. What is it like? Well, we would think that it looks like this, and maybe in the 1930s it did, and maybe all the way into the 1980s and 90s it might have in some cases. I don't know of anyone doing horse logging anymore, but I did when I first moved to Massachusetts. There was still one old guy doing it. This is a picture from Vermont, where they still have some people that are doing horse logging. I don't know if this is going to play. This is a video from Wendell State Forest. And that's the kind of machinery that is used. And it's more than 1 horsepower. The folks who were there protesting, this is in a state forest, state-owned lands. And this logger was actually what's called a master logger. It was highly certified by the state and is an award-winning logger. And as you'll see, this operator was using this equipment to threaten the protesters. They were standing on a road. This is a picture of public land logging, a DCR approved so-called forest restoration project in Muddy Brook. And there is a video link down at the bottom there for a video flyover of the area with drone footage. To me, I went out and looked at this. I actually took this picture. This was not forest management or forest restoration. This was really forest elimination. More than 95% of the trees were removed from this area. It was about 1,500 acres altogether. And there was no attempt to conserve carbon or conserve the old trees that were present here. It was about 100-year-old to 120-year-old forest. We counted some rings of some of the larger stumps. So from my opinion, from my experience, the state is not practicing climate-friendly forestry or whatever else you would want to term it. And this is a slide of the DCR's own estimate of the impact of logging on forests. And this was a presentation given by the head of the management forestry program. And the green line on that graph shows basically over a 100-year period that the forest would be capturing, storing twice as much carbon over that period of time as would be captured in the previous slide, the area that was clear cut. It looks like if the forest started at around 60 to 70 tons per acre, if it was clear cut after 100 years, it would take about 80 years for it to get back to where it had been. And then it would have another few years to accumulate some carbon. But if it was uncut, and that's what the reserve refers to, the reserves are areas that are not cut, the amount of carbon would go from about 75 up to about 130. So it would just about double in that time period. Now, different types of forests or different types of trees have different rates of carbon accumulation, but I think this is just a good example. I'll show another one here. This is from research done by Nunnery and Keaton, a report that was published, and that again is a hyperlink, and essentially showing the same basic thing, that this no-cut red line shows the amount of carbon being stored, and it is, well, depending upon the type of logging, it is twice as much or more, or slightly less than twice as much carbon that is being stored over an extended time period. And the amount continues. I'm not sure what the little drop off is at the very end there, at the very end of the red line. I don't know exactly what that means, but for the next 100 years, or in this case, 150 years, there is an increasing amount of carbon stored throughout that. And most of our forests in Massachusetts are at a very basically young stage, and they still have literally hundreds of years of growth left in them to keep accumulating, capturing, and storing carbon. So another way to show this relationship between the size of trees is that if you had one mature canopy tree in your forest, let's say it's a 100-foot oak tree, that amount of carbon, 8 tons of carbon in that one tree, it would take 35 trees, half that height, 50-foot tall trees. It would take 35 of those younger trees. Or if you just went a little shorter to 40-foot tall trees, it would take 150 times more trees, 151 trees to store the same amount of carbon, to store that 8 tons of carbon. And if you get up even to the quarter height of that 100-foot tree, now you're talking about almost 500 trees necessary. So as trees get bigger, they store increasing amounts of carbon because they have more mass and they have more leaves. And so in order to store large amounts of carbon, it really requires large trees, and trees get bigger as they get older. So we're really talking about protecting the older trees in the forest, which also happen to be the ones that are targeted for logging because they're the most valuable for their wood. But to my way of thinking, they're actually much more valuable for their carbon that's being stored, and also for their potential for carbon removal. This is a very wordy explanation of that previous slide, but if you were to plant new trees, and I work very closely with the Greenfield Tree Committee, we're in the process of planting 800 trees in Greenfield. We got a grant from DCR, and I don't want to make DCR out to be an evil state agency. They actually do great things. I'm a big fan of state parks, and DCR has a fantastic urban forestry program and greening the gateway cities, and they do a great job. We've been working on a 3-year grant here in Greenfield, like I said, to plant 800 trees. But for these newly planted trees that are basically an inch in diameter when you plant them, it would take 61,000 trees to store that 8 tons of carbon that is stored in one mature 100-year-old oak tree. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be planting trees. We should be planting trees everywhere, whenever we can. But what I am saying is that it is so much more critical to protect the existing big trees that we have that are storing that carbon, and that will continue. A 100-year-old oak tree still has another 200 or 300 years of life left in it. Oaks often live to be 400 or 500 years old. So it's really critical for us to be protecting those mature large trees now, because their potential for carbon storage is going to be doubling pretty much every 50 years going forward. So a couple of key research papers for carbon in forests. This gets to this one by Lutz et al. Talks about these large diameter trees. Roughly about half of the biomass, and this is for forests, all forests worldwide, the same thing holds true, that the large diameter trees are the most important. And roughly 1%, those biggest trees store about half of the carbon in a forest. Another very, very important recent paper by Bill Muma and Susan Messino introduces this idea of proforestation. So there is reforestation for planting where forests used to be. Maybe they were cut down, or maybe it was agricultural land, and now you want to reforest it. You can plant trees. In most cases, it's better to allow the native trees to reestablish an area. But in some cases, planting some trees helps that to happen, especially if they're locally sourced trees. But then there's a thing called afforestation, which, I mean, that could be abandoned strip mines, that could be afforested, reforested, because no forests there are there now. It could be other abandoned lands, or it could be agricultural lands that have not had a tree on them for a long time. That could be a form of afforestation. But really the most important thing that we could do right now is this concept of proforestation, which is protecting the existing forests that we have and allowing them to continue to grow older, to approach their ecological potential for carbon storage. And that would also greatly enhance the protection of biodiversity as well. Because as forests get older, they become more complex and they can provide much greater range of habitats or ecological niches within a more complex system. And that is critical for protecting biodiversity. So proforestation is actually much cheaper than reforestation or afforestation, because it only requires protecting something that already exists, instead of putting in a lot of effort to reclaim an area and try to encourage trees to grow back in an area where they haven't been growing naturally or unnaturally, depending upon how the land was abused or managed. So that's a very important paper. Another one that includes those two previous authors, Susan Messino and Bill Muma, and also includes Bob Leverett, who is, to me, is the Eastern old growth guru. I met him first in the early 90s when he took me out to a lot of old growth areas in Massachusetts. At the time, no one really knew that there was any old growth remaining in Massachusetts, and Bob found quite a few pockets that added up to probably a couple thousand acres across the state. Some of it on Mount Wachusett, quite a bit of it further west in the Cold River Valley Gorge, or the Deerfield River Gorge in Western Mass, but some of it out on Mount Greylock and various other places, typically on extremely steep areas that were inaccessible at the time when most of Massachusetts was cleared. And those small pockets, remnants remained, and they're fantastic to visit. I've been to quite a few of them. But Bob Leverett has done modeling of older trees and has shown that these trees continue to increase the amount of carbon that they remove from the atmosphere and store, sequester into the wood as they get older and older. And then two great references from the Northeast Wilderness Trust about permanently protecting forests and allowing them to grow for the climate benefits. Volume 1, and then a second shorter supplement about wild carbon. And the second supplement was put out just to address this confusion of how young forests or young trees grow faster than old trees. And they do if you're just looking at the height of the tree. But if you're looking at the amount of carbon being stored per area or per acre, or however you want to measure it, it's the older forests that have accumulated more carbon and are continuing to accumulate and store more carbon than a young forest does. So the critical roles of our forests, specifically, let's talk about urban or municipal forests in Massachusetts and how to implement the next generation climate roadmap bill. So in this session, we had a couple of bills that have been reported favorably out of committee, and those numbers are H905, S504. They're both the same bill, an act establishing municipal reforestation program. And these bills would require towns to have a reforestation plan. It has a lot of great parts to the bill. It is about 12 pages long. If you want to read it, it is very interesting. And it would establish an urban forestry advisory council that would implement this law focused on municipal forests, municipal trees, or city trees, public trees, shade trees. And it would do, I think, a lot. Calculations are that urban forests could supply as much as 20% of the carbon removal from the atmosphere in order to meet net zero in 2050. And that's pretty significant. 20% is a good chunk of what we need to do. And these are links that you can click on, a fact sheet on municipal reforestation. I think that would be a great bill to pass. And so that could be one way to help address the need to protect and even plant many more trees for all of the climate benefits that trees provide, especially in urban settings. But even in non-urban areas, trees provide tremendous benefits. Another thing that could happen, and I'm not sure what the status of this bill is, but in Massachusetts, there's a thing called Chapter 61, which provides incentives for active timber management of forest lands by providing a very significant tax break, property tax break, for the forest owners who enroll their land for a 10-year time period. In light of the climate emergency, I think that this Chapter 61 program needs to be reformed. It needs to be kind of turned on its head, in that we should be providing incentives to protect the carbon storage of forests. And I believe that the state, or in this case, the towns, should be providing a tax incentive, a reduction for people who are storing increasing amounts of carbon. And I think that the states should be using climate change funding to promote that and to help the towns, assist the towns to do that. This Senate bill, which was introduced by Senator Adam Hines, it didn't go far enough, in my opinion. But it would increase that commitment to a 20-year time period. And it would acknowledge the really significant climate benefits that forests do provide, and not just provide incentives for cutting down forests, which is what the current program really does. So I think there probably should be some benefit, some tax benefit for having your land as a working forest or in active timber management. But I believe it should be much less than it is, and that the lands that are truly supplying a very positive carbon benefit should get the most reduction, the most benefit, subsidy, whatever you want to call it, for their carbon storage. So I think my take-home message really is that, as the IPCC report pointed out, we have a very narrow window of opportunity. It is closing rapidly. Do we have until 2030? Perhaps, but I think that that report was very sobering, and really, if we needed another wake-up call, I think it provided that. The last report, of course, in the fall was called Code Red for Humanity. I'm not sure what color comes after Code Red, but we're at that point where we just don't have any time to waste. We need to adopt proforestation as a statewide policy. We need to provide incentives for forest protection, and that includes towns getting more funding to preserve more open space and allow those forests to continue to increase their amount of carbon that they're going to be storing over the next 30 years to make it to 2050. And another really important point that I'm sure you've talked about in the past is that we do need to reduce our consumption of natural resources, including wood, including forest products. We cannot continue to consume, which has really led us to the situation that we are in currently. And we're not going to get out of this by consuming our way out of the climate emergency. And that protecting existing older trees now will pay increasing dividends into the future, climate dividends. And it is an uncertain future that faces us. We are in a period of non-linear change when it comes to the climate. We can't predict what's going to happen based on, what the climate has been like in the past, because there are so many things that are changing that make it unpredictable. But we can count on trees to continue to do what they've been doing literally for millions of years. And that is to store carbon and to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So my suggestion is that people get active. We need to pass legislation. Right now, there is work being done on a climate bill. In addition to the offshore wind bill, there is another omnibus climate bill being put together. And it would be good to contact your elected officials, your state senator and representative, and tell them that we need to protect forests as part of the implementation of the next generation roadmap bill. if we're gonna have any chance of meeting this goal of net zero, we're gonna have to start protecting forests now so that they can ramp up the amount of carbon that they're removing from the atmosphere. And my feeling is that town-owned forests can provide a significant amount of climate benefit. And a town like Stow could really be a climate champion by ensuring that those forests are allowed to continue to grow towards their ecological potential. And protecting our public forests is really essential. It's the one thing that we can do because we already own that land. We're not telling a private landowner what they should do with their land. There's no question of private property rights because the town really already bought that land. And so as a town, you should be able to decide that you want to protect your forests. And I think the state is going to have to come up with a program to greatly incentivize the protection of forests. There's talk about doing some kind of a carbon credit program at the state level or some kind of a carbon offset program. And I imagine that that's going to be up to the next administration to figure out how to implement that. But my opinion, there's going to have to be a significant buy-in from the state to enhance protection of existing forests and increase the incentives for leaving forests intact, both for climate and for biodiversity. So that is my final quote from Henry David Thoreau. In wildness is the preservation of the world. And I think in some ways, the world has lost a lot of its wildness, with urbanization and the increase in the population. But in some ways, our forests have probably recovered. I think if Henry David was here in Massachusetts today, he would be amazed at the amount of forest cover that exists, because when he was living in Massachusetts, there were very few areas of forest. So the forests have recovered, but we need to help them continue to cover. And we do need to do what's commonly referred to as rewilding, allowing places to regain their wild, inherent, intrinsic nature, to let that exuberance continue to bloom and blossom. And by doing that, we would be preserving or protecting the wildness that surrounds us and allowing it to grow. So that is the end. I'll stop sharing my slide, and I'm happy to answer questions. And just so you know, if it's not obvious, I'm very biased toward forest protection. So if you ask me a question, you're probably going to get a biased response. So I'll apologize right at the start for that.
One question I have is kind of related, but not directly, is I've been assuming that burning firewood, we have a wood stove at our house, and I figured, well, it was more environmental to burn a wood stove than an oil furnace to help heat our house, because the trees grow and absorb carbon, and then you burn the trees, and the carbon they're releasing isn't fossil carbon that's been tied up millions of years in fossil fuels. Is that true? Am I wrong about that?
Well, it does sound, it sounds good, but unfortunately, the trees can't tell the difference between the carbon dioxide that comes from burning wood or the carbon dioxide that comes from burning fossil fuels. And the atmosphere is already overburdened with CO2. And it turns out that our forests are only removing about 20% of the CO2 that we're generating currently. And so adding more CO2 to the atmosphere is something that we actually have to stop doing that. We have to reduce, as the next generation roadmap bill sets as a target, we have to reduce our CO2 emissions or all greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And that's just coming right up. And then ultimately reduce it by 85% by 2050. So unfortunately, burning wood doesn't get you any benefit as compared to burning fossil fuel. We need to eliminate both of them, and we need to electrify. We need to go to air source heat pumps, solar electricity, offshore wind, if we want to be able to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and let our forests really do what, the best that they can do. So we can't take any credit for burning wood,
Okay.
unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Ellen,
Hi, we have this dilemma that we are humans who can't live with our fur on in this climate. So we want to heat our house. Our house faces southeast. No, southwest, I'm sorry. And we have trees on that side, and we're planning to put solar stuff on the roof, photovoltaics. But there's this oak tree that's ginormous. And then there's that double hickory tree. There's an oak tree that the town owns. And then there's another oak tree. And they're all shade the roof. So do we get solar to reduce our, to make our own electricity, or do we leave the trees there to save the carbon? And I know what's going to happen because it's not just me deciding this, and it's a family decision. But I really wonder where it's a dilemma. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that we're going to have to be careful where we're planting trees going forward with, any kind of a reforestation program, because we have to make those considerations. Existing trees, I don't know, the specifics, but in some cases, some trees can be pruned, although it can be very expensive. A big old oak tree is storing a lot of carbon and is still probably, like I said, it has probably 100 or 200 or 300 years left in its life. Maybe, depending upon the setting, maybe not that much, but there's going to be a lot of challenges in putting solar panels in areas that don't require chopping down all the trees. And this is a big issue across the state with deforestation and industrial solar projects. I know it's all over. It's in Western Mass. It's in all parts of the state. And so there needs to be these incentives that need to be adjusted so that we're not incentivizing that kind of stuff. And then on an individual case-by-case basis, I think you have to do some calculations and figure, what is the benefit, what is the loss from cutting down those trees. They're going to be hard decisions to make. I can't tell you what the best decision is. It's going to be tough. But if you have a roof and you can put solar on it, then you may have to try to replace those trees with others.
Can you suggest a few varieties of maybe medium height trees that would be good to replace and put in between what remains?
We have at the Greenfield Tree Committee, we've put together a great website that has lists of trees. It's Greenfield Tree Committee.
Okay,
If you search for that, it has a really nice listing of trees with their heights and various attributes.
right, yeah.
Yeah, the thing is that some trees are going to have to be cut down, but I think the goal should be to save all of the trees that we can. I have solar panels on my roof. I don't have trees in the side of the yard that are blocking it, but if I wanted to put them facing west, I would.
This is Dick Perkins calling in, and I want to complicate your discussion, Glenn. It's good and it's interesting, and there are some factors that that you don't talk about that are very important. First of all, one of our most important building products is wood. A lot of that has been replaced by steel and concrete, which are way worse in terms of generating CO2 in their manufacture than wood is. So every time you replace a beam of wood with a beam of iron, you're really hurting the environment badly. So if you put that in the whole total equation, you really have to think about that. And there's lots of good evidence that it is important to figure out more and better ways to use wood. And we're getting there. We're doing some very good engineered wood products and so forth that really help the environment dramatically versus our standard building techniques. That's one item. Another item is if you don't manage the forest carefully and with good stewardship, everything you say, Glenn, goes on. But if you do a really good job of forest stewardship, you can continue to increase the total amount of carbon capture within the woods while still harvesting some wood for essential uses. And one example of that here in Stow is the Leggett property owned by the Stow Conservation Trust. That property was a very thick white pine forest. It was so thick that the trees were getting spindly, their crowns were getting less pronounced, their carbon capture, while not measured by us, was certainly not improving. We did a forest timber harvest there, and since that harvest, the remaining trees, which now are almost full crown cover, increased their rate of growth by double. So, Glenn, your point about the old trees are better in terms of carbon capture, the way we achieved that on the Leggett property was by doing a harvest, while also gaining the extra good wood products. So anyway, I think we have to keep balancing all these things. And I know a lot of people just say, don't cut the forest, just keep it all wild. I don't think that's the right answer. The New England Forestry Foundation, which you probably are familiar with, they have a piece of land in Leverett. They are promoting something they're calling exemplary forestry. And that is a system which, if adopted by the foresters that you get to plan your forest cut and so forth, will lead to better growth and the largest amount of carbon capture. So, there's lots of things going on besides just don't cut. I don't want any of us to think the best answer is don't cut.
Well, I'll just try to respond. So the first thing is that um, there are goals that are being set at the national level to approximate 30 by 30, 30% protected lands by 2030. And, you know, that goal would require stopping commercial exploitation of 30% of the landscape surrounding us. And I'm not saying that it would have to be entirely off limits to all management. We certainly should be addressing invasive species in a forest and some other things. But when you talk about commercial management of forests, it often requires a lot of money. Someone needs to pay for that management. And usually the way it's paid for is out of the timber sale receipts. And so in order to pay for active management, you have to cut down you have to have a financial return on that. And so that's where you get into the problems of doing things for financial return versus doing what's better for biodiversity or better for the environment. And so in my opinion, when we're talking about public lands, I believe it is easier to manage those because they don't require a financial return. And if the state were to put in place incentives, then those lands that are storing more carbon would have a return on that investment, essentially. So I think that there could be a lot that's changed by policy. When you're talking about management of private lands, that isn't, to me, that's an entirely different matter. And the final thing I want to point out is that when you're talking about substitution, there was a thing called the myth of substitution, a very important paper written a few years ago by Leturk called The Myth of Substitution, which points out that these arguments that are made for replacing steel and concrete with wood don't actually result in replacing of anything. They're not substituting for that. And that's an important point that needs to be made, is that unless you're eliminating one thing, you're not really substituting for something else. So there's a big push right now to do cross-laminated timber from trees to create high-rise buildings out of these massive timber elements. And for the most part, the wood that has been used for creating those cross-laminated timber members, and I'll use UMass as an example. They built the Ulver Design Building at UMass, on the UMass campus in Amherst. That was made from old growth primary forest timber, mostly from Canada and Alaska. And that, in that case, yes, those pieces of wood are storing carbon, but the amount of carbon that was released from the logging, from the manufacturing of those timber components, is less than half of the carbon that's being stored. In most cases, only about 25% of the carbon that is removed from the forest ends up in a long-lived wood product. So you're still releasing 75% of that harvested carbon into the atmosphere. And that's just something that we cannot continue to do. I agree with you that we have to find better ways to do things. We always have to find better ways, but we can't just rely on the things that we've done in the past to take us into the future, because the things that we've done in the past have gotten us to this crisis that we're in. And we really need to rethink the way, we need to rethink our relationship with nature and with forests, especially the older forests that exist today. And I'm not saying that we can't cut another tree, that we can never cut another tree, but we really need to set aside areas that are protected from human exploitation, because there are so many perverse incentives and financial incentives that make us do the wrong things for the climate. Like I said, I'm biased. I'm in favor of protecting these forests because I believe it's critical that we do so in order to get us to have a chance to survive really to 2050 without the devastating climate impacts that the consensus of scientists are telling us that we are in for. I really think that we have no time to waste.
So the UMass example is an interesting example. We don't yet have manufacturing facilities for crosslamb and so forth in the Northeast, although it's on the boards. And the promise of that kind of construction is you don't need to use old growth forest in order to produce it. You can use young wood and low quality wood and come up with a very strong product at a minor percentage of the energy cost to do the same thing with steel and concrete. So, I mean, you're right about that particular project at UMass, which is like it's a pilot project. It's a beautiful building, but it's a pilot project, and it does not represent the future of these manufactured wood products.
Yeah, I have not seen any materials that have been produced from local wood, from our relatively young forests in Massachusetts. I mean, we just don't have the kind of forests that they have in Alaska. You know, the primary forests that really are being logged for this kind of use. So I think that if that were to happen in Massachusetts, there is a lot of wood that comes out of municipalities, a lot of wood that comes from storm damage and other purposes. And so if that could be diverted into something like that, where there's long-term storage, instead of sending it all to the biomass power plant in Fitchburg, Princeton, Pine Tree, or sending it up to New Hampshire and Maine to burn in their biomass facilities, where that CO2 is instantaneously released to the atmosphere, I think that would be better. That would be a reduction. And right now, our state government is incentivizing burning of trees, trying to change the renewable portfolio standards to incentivize burning of trees. Mostly that'll be happening out of state, but that's taking clean energy credits and shipping them to Maine and New Hampshire. And that's really the wrong direction to be going in the face of a climate emergency. So I agree with you. There could be much better use of waste wood. But that, again, that's going to need to be incentivized. And we should be doing that kind of research for the kind of what I'm talking about. We've lost, just in Greenfield, we have lost hundreds of big trees, mostly Norway maples, which are just at the end of their life. And they were planted for a long time, as kind of more than half the trees in Greenfield are Norway maples. And they should all come down at some point, but they shouldn't be burned. They should be going into some kind of a long-lived product. And if they could be used for cross-laminated timber, that would be great. I've seen acres and acres of these huge trees cut down, piled up, acres of them. So that's, that would be a good use, but we need to do it carefully. We need to be thoughtful about it, and we need to keep in mind the climate impact of all of these things. Everything we do really needs to be carefully weighed and measured and analyzed to make sure it has a positive climate impact. Otherwise, our goose is cooked at this point if we don't change.
One of the interesting things I've read in the last few months is that while we think of the Amazon as the forest that will save us, it's the forest that will capture all the carbon and produce, manage the atmosphere in terms of rain and so forth. It's actually the boreal forest that is the biggest contributor, or not, to the success of our climate. The boreal forest is our forest. It's the one that we have in the northern hemisphere around us. And I didn't realize that. I thought it had to be down in the Amazon. No, it's around us right here, the boreal forest.
Yeah, we really do need to protect those intact forests. A lot of Canada is being logged, especially now for pellet manufacturer to ship over to Europe, because, you know, the UK claims to be 60% renewable energy, but almost 90% of that renewable energy is from burning trees in coal-fired power plants. They've converted them to burning wood, and then they claim that it's emitting zero carbon. It's actually emitting more carbon dioxide than burning coal. But because they're supposed to count the carbon impact when they log the forest, which no one does, then they get to not count it. It's an accounting error. They get to not count it out of the smokestack. And so that's something that really needs to change. We need to have more of a reverence for forests, and the climate crisis is the same as the biodiversity crisis. We have this double crisis that's occurring, and really forest protection is essential to addressing both of those crises. They're the same, you know, if you want to say there's two sides of the same coin, whatever, they're the same thing. They're one and the same.
I see Carol has her hand up, and I think, Alan, were you going to ask a question too? Okay, so we got two questions, and then we should probably, oh, Tom, were you going to have a question? Okay, so we got three questions, and then we've got to wrap it up and let you get on with your evening.
No problem.
Okay, Alan, I guess first.
Hi, Glenn. How you doing?
Good.
So your talk tonight was really mostly about the public forests in Massachusetts, and you know I'm kind of with you there on public lands, that we ought to be doing, you know, a smart approach to cutting and make sure there are exceptionally good reasons to do so whenever that has to happen. But on private lands, you haven't really talked about private lands much. This is an issue I've actually wondered about for quite a while. And here's my concern. All over New England, including in Massachusetts, we have, you know, dozens or hundreds of private landowners who have woodlots. And they make a little money off these woodlots. You were talking about the incentives. And it's one of the reasons they keep their property, you know, because of the income stream that it does generate for them. And I've always worried that if the rules were changed and we really kind of clamped down on that type of activity, many of those private landowners would say, screw this, and just sell their property. And the next year, you know, we have a 60-lot housing development with no trees. So it seemed to me that over the long run, it makes sense to provide some incentives for these private woodland owners to continue doing what they're doing, because on balance, it will provide us more benefits than the alternative. Am I off base with that thinking?
No, I think that there are a couple of things to consider. For the most part, the private property owner does not get enough financial return from logging to offset the amount of money they would make from development. There really is pretty much no comparison between the property value for whatever you want to call it, you know, development versus the amount of income that you would get from harvesting trees. Most of the time, if someone's going to develop their land, they'll probably completely log it before they do so, just to take advantage of both things. But I think that the incentives for leaving forests intact really need to be changed so that it's a financial benefit to private landowners as well, to put their lands into whatever you want to call it, a carbon reserve or a biodiversity reserve. And that should be subsidized through some kind of a carbon tax or, some other funding mechanism. I'm not sure what it will be, but the state is talking exactly about doing that, about implementing some kind of a carbon credit, carbon offset program. They're not sure what it's going to be, but that would help private landowners to keep their land intact. Even if we do it for the next 30 years, that's the time frame that is really critical right now. If in order for us to reduce our emissions by 50%, that is going to be a huge endeavor by 2030. Right now, the projection is that we're going to increase our emissions by about 20% if we continue with business as usual, and not decrease it by 50%. So things are going to have to change. And one of the things I think that will have to change are these incentives for private landowners to keep their land intact. There has to be a financial incentive there. And, as far as developing, I know where I lived, most of the easily developable land has already been developed. There is not a lot of land available. It costs a lot more to build on very marginal lands, especially areas that have wetland issues and all kinds of other issues. So those lands have a value right now, and they need to be recognized as having a value for the climate. And so there needs to be these incentives that are provided. When I was on a land trust for 15 years, and I always felt that if you really wanted to protect land, you should buy it. And that was what I tried to do for 15 years, was to buy land using Community Preservation Act funds and foundation funds and private philanthropy. And, we bought hundreds of acres of land. And so I'm a big supporter of the Northeast Wilderness Trust, because that's exactly their model. They're trying to protect lands for this time period that is really critical for us, which is really from now until mid-century, trying to get control on the climate emergency that we're in. So private lands have a role to play in that, and changing policies is really going to be critical. And we need smart people like you, Alan, thinking about how to accomplish that. We all need to be thinking about that.
I think we have two last questions, Glenn. We'll try to wrap up by 8:30. And
that's fine.
Tom, I apologize. I guess you might have had your hand up for a long time. So
It's
I'll
because he
call
has
you
such a
look
nice
out.
virtual background.
Yeah, it was lost in your trees and so forth. I didn't see the hand up there. I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's hidden in the trees. Yeah. My question is just about your presentation about the storage capacity of trees. And you had mentioned that, is that the total storage over lifetime, or is that a rate of storage? Because I would imagine that the rate of storage of smaller trees is still pretty high. And that's actually would be fine to plant little trees because their rate will be good. And we're actually looking for rates here. We're not looking for total storage, because once it's stored, it's gone.
Yeah, so with small trees, you need a lot more of those trees. And as a densely stocked forest grows, there's a natural selection that occurs among those trees. And so most of those small trees, are going to die.
I was actually
And
asking about
only a few are going to survive, and it's only those few that survive that are continuing to store the carbon. So
see.
many of those small trees, even though they may be growing quickly, most of them are going to die. Most of that carbon is going to not be stored long term. Some of it is going to be recycled into the soil, but quite a bit of it is going to be released into the atmosphere. So it's these surviving trees, and typically when they get to a certain point, they're the emergent trees that emerge out of the smaller ones. Those are the ones that are going to survive long term. And it could be because they have better genetics or a better location or something like that. And those are the ones that are going to be continuing to store carbon, for the next half century, the time period that is really essential to see if we actually make it that far. So the small trees, yeah, we need to plant more trees, but it makes no sense to be cutting down existing trees in the hopes that young trees are going to replace them and grow faster. If you cut down a 100-year-old tree, it's going to take 100 years to replace that tree. That's just the way it works. A tree that you plant this year is not going to approach the carbon that is being stored right now by a 100-year-old tree, literally for another 80 to 100 years. Can't hear you, Tom. Go ahead. Now we can.
It's these large trees will eventually stop storing carbon, maybe in 400 years. And then we'll have a constant amount of carbon, and there will be no place to put more carbon, right?
Well, no, I don't think anyone really knows that, because we haven't been measuring old growth forests for that long. They're actually relatively new scientific finding. And so what has been measured is that old growth forests continue to accumulate and store carbon, and there hasn't been an endpoint. And the common understanding of an old growth forest system is that it's what's called dynamic equilibrium. So when one tree dies, it creates an opening, and younger trees grow up in that opening. And most of the carbon in an intact system like that is part of the cycling, part of the energy cycle within the forest. And so that carbon, it's not like when a tree dies in an intact forest, it is somehow converted into club soda and evaporates. The CO2 evaporates, bubbles out of the tree. It has to go through literally decades of microbial transformations. And in some cases, a century of microbial transformations. Everything is mediated by microbes, because those bonds in the tree, those carbon bonds in cellulose, lignin, and all those complex materials, they don't break down by themselves. They require certain special enzymes that fungi and some bacteria produce. And so everything is mediated by microbes. And most of that energy that's embodied in a tree, like the same amount of energy you would get if you burn that tree, that same energy is what sustains the forest ecosystem and keeps all of those cycling things happening, all the nutrient cycles, all the energy cycles within the forest. And so I think that the best way to look at it is to say the existing energy that's stored in a forest continues to accumulate both above and below ground. And as the forest gets older, more of that energy is stored below ground than above ground. And we don't really know what the endpoint is until eventually, we may have another ice age, in which case in Massachusetts, pretty much everything was scraped clean. There were no forests, 12,000 years ago.
Maybe in your graph, that's where that little dip was at the end. Maybe that was showing what happens in 160 years. We may have all the carbon stored we can.
It could be. I should look at that again and try to figure out what that small deflection was. I don't know. I'm not sure what that was about.
there are some reports that as the planet continues to heat, at some level of heating, trees and their soil start to release carbon.
Yes. And that's pretty scary to think about.
So I
So-
want to, we have one last
Yep.
question here from Carol. And then I want to let you go, Glenn. This has been a great conversation. Carol.
Hi, Glenn. I keep hearing this argument about, on public lands, it's okay to sell off and cull the forest out to leave space for the trees and new growth. Yet when the settlers came to the US, the documentation that we have is that there was solid forest from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. And that forest thrived. It was alive, and no one was out there culling, every fifth tree or whatever to make the forest be alive. And so my question is, are we meddling too much by going in and culling out trees? I could see if there's some kind of invasive that is killing all the trees, that maybe then there's a good reason to cull that out. But I just don't understand the argument of why it's okay to go in and pull out trees out of a healthy forest.
Well, I think I agree with you in that for public lands, these lands were protected for a purpose. And really the law that I didn't show a slide of, but it's chapter 132A, section 2B, and it says that the purpose of our public acquired lands is really for the quiet enjoyment of the people. And it even goes further and says that no commercial activities shall be allowed except those that are essential to the quiet enjoyment of the people. And so that, for me, that means public lands really have that overriding purpose to provide those things to the public for a public benefit. Now, yes, harvesting wood has a public benefit, but I believe that private lands can easily supply that, and that public lands have what I consider a higher calling, because we all chipped in to protect those lands. And I think that we all deserve to enjoy those. We do not have old growth forests, to any extent in Massachusetts, less than 0.1%. Now, I spend a lot of time out in the Adirondacks, where there are several 100,000 acres of old growth forests in the Adirondacks. In fact, the New York State Constitution protects forests within the Adirondack Preserve and the Catskill Preserve. And the Adirondack Preserve is the largest protected park in the continental US, in the lower 48, larger than any national park. But 50% approximately is owned by the public, and those lands are designated either as wild forests or as wilderness. And there is no commercial logging that occurs on the lands that are owned by the state of New York, because it is forbidden in the New York State Constitution. And I really think that we need to have a similar constitutional amendment in Massachusetts to protect the publicly owned forests that we all purchase together, that our children and our grandchildren, if we can make it through the climate disaster that we're in, they deserve to be able to experience old growth forests and not have to drive to Alaska or to the Western US or even to the Adirondacks to experience that, because they are truly incredible.
Are town forests considered public forests?
Yes, yes, they certainly are. They're owned by the pub. They're owned by, I mean, in your case, they're owned by the people of Stow, or perhaps, a land trust or something like that. But I include town forests and the state-owned forests in the same category. I think that they all need to have management that is guided primarily by addressing the climate emergency. And we need to make sure that what we're doing has a positive, as much as possible, I mean, to the full extent possible, a positive climate impact. And that is not something that we're doing now. We're certainly not doing that on state-owned lands. There has never been a climate analysis done that shows what the climate impact is from logging on public lands. And we need to be doing that. We really need to. It's way past time to do it.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Glenn. One last question for you before you go. So you had some great slides and you had some links in those slides. How do you want to share them?
I will send you the PDF,
Okay,
which has live links in it. I'll email that to you.
okay. And then if anybody, of course, here tonight wants to get in touch with me, you'll see me writing and sending out, Facebook posts and so forth when we have the recording from tonight. And by all means, reach out and I'll get you Glenn's link to the slideshow.
Can the host send it to the list of registrars?
That's an interesting question.
Where would you like it sent?
Can you send so Glenn's slides, which has some very good links in them.
Yep.
Can we send that to the list of registrants tonight? Do we have
Yes, I could do that. Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a small PDF attachment. It's not too big.
Yeah. Do you want to send me that or?
I'll send it to Rick.
Okay, perfect.
I'll get it to you, Tina. Tina's
Okay.
on vacation this week, so thank you for being with us.
No
But
worries. It was
if
great.
it
Thank
takes a
you.
day or two, don't worry,
Well,
All right.
I'd want to thank everyone for coming. And I really appreciate this opportunity. Like I said, I am very opinionated, but I'm really happy to spread the gospel whenever possible.
And thank you, Glenn. I'm really glad to have you here talking with us. And hey, you kept this whole audience the whole time. Nobody got up and left.
I would like to thank you. I thought it was very informative and I really appreciate your coming and speaking.
Well, keep up the great work in Stow.
I think it was eye-opening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, all. Thank you.